doing this.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Would you like to start us off? The first poem that I marked um, is on page 11.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
And I've been just sort of prefacing the work by telling people that it's kind of like a braid of the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the ecological. So, in thinking about the pieces, since they aren't titled, the sections are titled, but the individual pieces aren't, just to be thinking about the illusion of separation within the self and between people and the landscape. I fell from the roof, but could not crack. Sank past the seawall, but would not drown. Ripped open my arm, but the worst part of me would not bleed. The river drew a breath. I heard it whipping up the gorge, almost threw me from my ledge. I drank gasoline, but would not light. Dug a hole in my throat, yet found no sound. Even mute, you hunted me.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed all the poems in this book, but that was the first one where I reached for the Post-it note to stick in there to have you ask you to read it because it's very moving. And this far into the book, I wasn't quite sure why yet. I think you have to read this entire book to really then go back and understand each poem. So you mentioned the idea that none of your poems are titled, and I was going to ask if there was an effect you were going for with the reader, like maybe reading the entire book as one poem with different stanzas, or if you were somehow creating like a river of poems that people could dip into without knowing what they're going to touch when they get into the poem. But what you said about braiding it with your interconnected themes makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thanks for that observation. I think it's multiple things. One, I've just never um, been great at titles. Maybe I don't feel particularly attracted to titles. I think some poets have amazing titles, so I'm not anti-title in general, but just for my own work, I'm not always sure where a piece ends and a new one begins. And I've kind of decided to embrace that and lean into it and let them flow together, even though there are certainly different movements within the book and between pieces. And so I think the book as a whole ends up having, if I've done my job, or, one possible intention would be having the effect of a piece of music almost with different movements within it. And I also like your observation that you kind of have to get to the end and go back to the beginning to figure out what you've read, because I certainly think about my work recursively and write in a recursive way, and definitely invite readers to, repeat individual poems and then repeat the book as a whole. I think that's something really lovely about poetry that's maybe not as possible with, long form prose, as if the whole book is only 4,000 words or whatever, it's possible to go back and dwell. So.
I listened to a podcast, and the person in the podcast said that your book was, quote, a non-narrative with a narrative, an intergenerational story that doesn't connect the dots. And that really helped me also think about the structure of this book. And can you tell a little about the intergenerational story aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was Michael Silverblatt who said that.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that was a good observation on his part. I started out in a very interior place writing this book, figuring out things happening within my own psyche and not necessarily the conscious aspect of my psyche. I often describe my process as being kind of like spelunking in my subconscious and the collective unconscious. So I'm not always sure what I'm going to find. But in trying to think about that illusion of separation and what I carry within myself, I found myself looking backward, which is, not necessarily a new theme in my life. My father was killed when I was 23, but he was a very devoted genealogist. And so by the time he passed away, he'd actually accumulated more than 30,000 names of my relations. So obviously not all direct ancestors. You know, he was well off in the weeds at that point, fourth cousins 5 times removed and all that. But thinking about what does it mean to have that weight of history coming down to a particular point. And so there are certainly family members who make cameos in the book, even though it's not a memoir. And, you know, once you write a collection of poems, it kind of takes on a life of its own that is informed by reality, but not direct reporting necessarily. But certainly my father makes cameos. My maternal grandmother, who was very religious, but also very superstitious and had a lot of phobias and read tea leaves and put curses on people. And then my great-grandparents on my father's mother's side also play a pretty integral role. So they lived on Ingalik, which is Little Diomede Island in the Bering Strait in the early 1900s, because my great-grandfather was there as a government school teacher. And so that's a story that had been passed down through the generations. My father never met him, but revered him because he revered his mother, who had also died too young. And so I was sort of teasing through that and thinking about this story that was passed down and what that meant on an individual level, but then also on a historical level, and these themes of settler colonialism, which are impossible to escape when talking about the government school system. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. The idea that a powerful act of will, the way these people made their way through their lives, creates a transcendence of its own, rather than something mystical. Is that kind of something that you were feeling from going back through these stories?
I think it's a combination. Again, in that idea of the illusion of separation, in some ways I'm resisting human agency, and in other ways I am embracing it. I'm resisting it in the sense that I think that it's an illusion that humans have controlled the landscape. We've certainly influenced the ecosystem, and now all that energy that we've put out is rebounding back on us in ways that we didn't anticipate and can't control, and are extremely damaging and causing a lot of suffering, not only to our species, but to all species, essentially. So that's a way in which we don't have agency and haven't recognized that we don't have agency. But I am also embracing the idea of human agency where it does exist. And I think one of the places that it does exist is in that realm of grief and trauma that you brought up. So, you know, I mentioned a traumatic event in my life. Kind of the big before after moment for me was my father being killed. And so that's one of my, you know, personal interests in trauma. And I have found that trauma is a kind of entrapment. It's a kind of imprisonment. It's a looping, which is maybe part of my interest in recursive forms, as I mentioned, because there's a way in which it's kind of a time capsule, and it, you know, you stumble into it and then can relive that intensity of emotion, you know, years and decades later, which is why then the transcendent element of the book, I'm glad that that comes through. I think comes through the grief, which is something it took me a long time to learn, instead of avoiding grief, to embrace grief. And that can actually be kind of the route out of that traumatic imprisonment. So there is some human agency in that, but maybe not in the way that popular culture thinks about, you know, life hacks and fixing your life and white knuckling and, you know, thinking your way through a difficult situation. One of the reasons that there's this whole web in the book among people and with the ecology is because I think that that kind of grieving and healing happens in relationship. And it's actually, even as it's very individually impactful, it's not actually something that we individually control.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I wonder if you would read the portion that is on page 21. It's in italics, and I do want to ask you, you know, why you move sometimes from italics to regular type. And I know one piece is a quote from a letter from one of your ancestors, but if you would read this one, I think it's a very short, beautiful piece, and I just would like to hear it read if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, of course. Yeah, and so it's the first poem in the second section of the book, which is titled Our Own Worst Consequence. Until the magnetic pole reverses, no amount of trying, will summon you a mother. Until the Arctic ice returns to its sheets and the calving thunder cracks backward. Haul yourself out, one frozen leg at a time.
That's truly an unforgettable poem. And I think it's
Thank you.
one that every reader can read and feel on their own personal level, and also then as sort of children of the earth and of creation, feel that sense of if we don't take care of it and we don't do things, then nothing's going to happen. Nobody's going to save us. And there's just such a lot in that short little poem. I wondered about, most of your poems are in couplets, but there are some that are not. And then there are the ones in italics and the ones that are not. What was your, how do you come to form for a poem? Does the form kind of determine what you're going to write, or what you're going to write about causes you to choose a different form?
Yeah, that's kind of the impossible and intriguing question for me. Those two are in tension. I think sometimes, I have a little fragment that seems to be in a form, and then that gives me some kind of guidance or, some sort of framework to hang the rest of a piece on, or as I collect other fragments that are maybe going to become that piece. But often it's just very intuitive, and the form in this book felt intuitive. So again, that idea of kind of knocking on the door of my subconscious and saying, what do you have for me today, was a lot of the process of this book. I tended to write in the morning. I wouldn't look at any screens. I'd read a little bit and then I'd meditate. And then I was listening to recordings of rain and working on this book. And so there's a element, to me anyway, of feeling that sort of natural progression of weather and in kind of an interior landscape that helped to shape the form. But yeah, as far as the italics, I had moments, to go back to that maternal grandmother who kind of makes some cameos in here, at least emotionally. I had moments of thinking about her fortune telling and how that, those kind of practices were in direct conflict in some ways, or seemed to be in direct conflict with her intense Christianity, which also was not a particularly nurturing force in my childhood, which I think comes through some of the religious themes in here. And so I think there are elements in the italicized pieces in particular that had, the flavor of telling a fortune, but also me speaking to myself, speakers speaking to ancestors, ancestors speaking back, the landscape speaking to humans, humans speaking to the cosmic future. It seemed to lean into that idea of direct address, even though the I and the you are pretty slippery in the book. So,
thank you. The other poem that another poem I was going to ask you to read is on page 60.
Whatever you do, the wheels will break away. Tomorrow they rusted out yesterday. You slept with your not love, waiting for the 11th floor, Wind River running green. What is a family? An evening your roots divide, cigarette smoke and shouts wafting up from the bars below.
Each poem is almost like a little vignette where you just fall into a scene or into a place with a character or characters and have an experience. And then the next poem is another one of those. And they are very connected. But it's like pearls on a string. It's really a wonderful collection.
Oh, thank you.
I skipped one that I was going to ask you to read if you didn't mind, and that's on 39.
Mm-hmm. In the end, there was no end. You limp along, coated in ash, glowing like radiation or starlight. I won't know which until you go. Besides, they are the same. So long I chased the resolution, how to make concrete feel remorse, swifts change course, bulbs will themselves not to bloom. You will leave one more unfinished row.
This poem in particular made me very conscious of how you're working with sound. And I think then I began reading the poems aloud, and I started to see that in more and more, where I hadn't noticed it before. I'm sure it had an effect on me, but until I read one out loud, it didn't really. But this one is very evocative orally. Um, I wondered, Publishers Weekly referred to this collection as Poetry of Witness. How do you feel about that as a category or a title for the type of poem you're writing?
That resonates with me, that idea of witness. I actually wrote a piece with the climatologist, Dr. Sarah Myrie, that we published jointly in resilience.org and Common Dreams, titled Embodying Climate Grief. And my book deals with more than just climate change. That's one of the strands, but not the only strand. Our piece, our conversation for Common Dreams was specifically about climate change. But one of the things that we were diving into was that idea of witness and an ethic of care and responsibility, and what are our choices in the face of cataclysm and the unspeakable, besides just turning away or numbing out or despairing and giving up because we get so bogged down in our despair. And so I think that idea of witness applies to the climate crisis that, makes appearances in this book, but also more generally to emotional cataclysm, to the unbearable within families and within the self. And it points to clarity, to being extremely clear about what's happening, even if we're not sure that anything can be done, or if it can be done, what that next step will be. And so I do think that there's a way in which this book inhabits the unresolved, and it doesn't end with a neat and tidy, moral or, yay. And then it, this was really hard, but now it's all good. That's not really what the book does. And yet I do like that you pointed to the idea of transcendence. And one of my fellow National Poetry Series winners in the 2020 cohort, Amanda Moore, when we had a conversation about the book, she said, that she felt a sense of joy. And she was one of the first people to point to that as opposed to just the grief in those conversations that I was having. And so I think that sometimes we shy away from seeing situations clearly because it seems like it'll be too painful if we can't change them. But sometimes that clarity itself is what causes a shift.
That's wonderful. You talk in the, I'm going to ask you to read the last poem in the book, but before that, you talk about you're in the author's note about the importance that different people, the important role they played in your creation of this book. And can you talk a little bit about poetry community and how that works for you and how you leverage that as a poet to make your work move forward?
Sure. I mean, I tend to be very introverted. So I've always thought of myself as being, bad at networking and, not really plugged into the scene. And yet when I go back and take stock, I've made so many amazing connections over the years through the community. Just, even though I'm not out there doing a lot of hardcore networking, just by being interested in this form and talking to other people who are interested in this form and reading alongside them and publishing alongside them, I found actually I have all these fellow travelers, and I feel very fortunate. And I am very deeply rooted in the small press scene. So, for 14 years, I was publishing in, by and large, small press journals, and I published a chapbook with Tarpaulin Sky and a full-length collection with Sidebrow, which are both amazing small presses that do, just gorgeous book design and very much small presses. And so it was kind of a shift in my sense of what my identity was as a poet and what community means when I did win this award and find out that I was being published by, the largest trade publisher in the country, Penguin. And I thought, but I'm a small press poet, and now it's like, well, I'm a poet, and both, and it's not even a dichotomy, all along the spectrum, there are editors and publishers and poets doing interesting work. And so it's been kind of an interesting exercise for me to let go of limiting myself to a particular category, that I can really deeply appreciate the small press world and be grateful to it, and do this project that I'm also proud of and work with amazing editors. But yeah, that community keeps me going. I'm also part of a writing group that's been meeting monthly for 15 years now, which is just an amazing gift. So, we don't always know what we're doing or where it's going or if it'll end up anywhere. And there's plenty that ends up on the cutting room floor. But having other people who appreciate language and being able to be in conversation with them is, I don't think I would have continued without that, because the rest of it, the publishing and getting noticed and all that, it's not guaranteed, and it's not consistent. So
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. If you would, I would love to have you read the poem on 68, which is the final poem in the collection.
absolutely. What then was the nature of light? The new system hung incommensurate, though it had the same name, as in marriage or mother. A ripple of photons banded at the margin, where we jumped, one state to another. I wanted for you the invisible door, the one you couldn't search for, the end of your breath's long hallway.
Thank you. And that was a very beautiful poem to end this collection with. I liked all of them, but that was a beautiful ending. Can you talk a little bit about the title Borderline Fortune? And I know you're averse to titles for poems, but that's a wonderful title. How did you come to that?
Oh, thank you. Multiple strands. Like I said, I was thinking about fortunes and fortune telling, and my grandmother in particular, my maternal grandmother, when I was originally working on some of the pieces. So some of those italicized ones were earlier in the making of this book. And then as I started excavating some of that family history, thinking about how blessings and curses are actually all part of the same fabric, that things are generally not all good or all bad. And, that, quote unquote, adventure story of my great grandfather's, for instance, like one person's adventure is another person's complete disruption of millennia old ways of life. So it's all bound up together, and it brought me here for better and for worse. So yeah, I was just really thinking about moving away from those dichotomies that can cause so much suffering, and toward that clarity, which is often requires holding space for contradictions and for a lack of resolution.
Thank you. Is there a poem that you'd like to read that nobody ever asked you to read from the poem? We're just so open to having you read any of them that you like.
Oh, thank you. Let me see. I mean, you hit on some of them. I don't know that I've read this one very much. On page 30. For years, I watched water lap the basement, tar oozing between white tiles, cockroaches like gilling knives. We stomped them and they'd stand up, crocodilian, scurry away. You said I was too direct, especially for a woman. But what direction? Fractures spilling out this chipped mouthful.
There's a lot of the unconscious in this poem that I think you were talking earlier about. So much comes from your subconscious, and I think this must be one of the poems where that's true. And also that idea of other people trying to define you by gender, of a woman should do this or shouldn't do this, or is capable of this or not, is a big issue here as well.
Yeah, throughout the book, I mean, I was fortunate enough to speak with Forrest Gander for the Montana Book Festival, and he brought up, I think he's one of the few to bring up, that he felt like there was a really overt feminism in the collection, which I thought was interesting that he hit on, because I didn't go into the book saying, I want to write a feminist tract.
Mhm.
And yet, when I heard that reflected back to me, I thought, yeah, that's there for sure. And on that idea of borderlines, certainly around gender roles and then around sexuality as well. I mean, I make brief reference to being queer in one of the earlier poems. But again, that's been like a fraught identity in my life, not necessarily for me, but in relation to the world. I came out when I was 14 and only dated women and went to a women's college, and then very intentionally went to another women's college where I didn't realize the grad program was co-ed, and accidentally met my partner, who is a cis man. And it's not a conversion story. It's just that idea of sort of expansiveness and being open to what comes. And I think one of the hardest parts of that experience was more other people grappling with my identity than me grappling with my identity. And I was speaking of that small press community, I was speaking with Elaine Bleakney, who's one of the poets published by Sidebrow, one of my presses. And she was talking about Keats's idea of negative capability. And I thought, oh yeah, what a good way to think about that, artists in the pursuit of truth and beauty can transcend some of those categories and be in those messy spaces that don't have, neat categories. And there are multiple points in my life where I can look at those opportunities to rise to that are, bigger than any one limited identity. And I think that's something that I was grappling toward in the book as well. So.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. Yeah, that's really, and so much of the thinking today is becoming much more. I don't want to use the word intersectional because it's a cliche, but it's becoming less to do with this is and this is not, and more sometimes this is and sometimes this is not, and so that is in keeping with that. I just can't thank you enough. It's been wonderful to hear you talk about this book, and I've felt such a pleasure while I was studying it and reading about it and listening about it. And is there anything else that you wanted to convey during the interview, or another poem you wanted to read, or?
I really appreciate your careful attention to it. It's been such a pleasure just, having a attentive reader and being in conversation with you. It's really an honor. As far as a final poem to go out on, maybe I'll finish with the one on page 65. You'd mentioned that I quote my great-grandmother's letter. About 40 miles from Nome, we encountered the ice. The woman who loved God could question. He brought her to the island, not, in fact, beatified. Pieces from 50 to 100 feet long above water. Might drink her away. His son's, his daughter's son. The names untangle something in the cells as they tug. Saint Michael, Point Hope.
Thank you again. That's all of these poems are wonderful, and that was a wonderful one to end with your great-grandmother. So thank you. And I look forward to reading more from you in the future.
Oh, thank you so much, Judy. It's been an honor.
Mhm.